I came across a video of a woman who was talking about fawning and how it is a survival mechanism, especially for autistic girls and women. And I will link the video below along with some other videos that I found to be helpful when it comes to talking about fawning and how it shows up for us. But I thought that I would just kind of talk a little bit about it myself and my own journey and how it's showed up and how I've noticed it in my own life personally. So I have been in therapy off and on for pretty much my entire life, but like I said in previous videos, I think the most intense therapy that I've received has been within these last 10 years of my life. And that is where I have learned the most about, myself and just my trauma and my coping mechanisms that weren't serving me and all of those kinds of, things that go along with working through trauma. So I came across in more recent years this concept of fawning as being part of a survival tactic alongside of fight, flight, and freeze. So I had heard a lot about fight, flight, or freeze. I was very familiar with those throughout my life, and I think especially in correlation with PTSD, that is something that I think most people are aware of, is when people with PTSD get triggered, they often will go into fight, flight, or freeze mode because those are the survival tactics that they learned when they were in traumatic situations. I think that it is really important to understand and to bring awareness to the fawn response, especially when it comes to girls and women who are autistic, because I think that we tend to use this a lot without realizing it. I know I personally did. I think from a very young age, pretty much as early as I can remember, I fawned, and the reason behind why I did was a lot like this woman was saying. It wasn't because I was seeking validation. It wasn't because I was trying to make other people happy or be accepted or anything like that. It truly was to survive, to keep myself safe. Because at some point along the way, I realized through other people's reaction toward me when I brought up really serious issues, tried to express my discomfort, tried to express, some sort of emotion that was not comfortable for them. They would try to guilt me, they would try to shame me, try to silence me, they would get angry at me, and I think through those reactions I learned that it wasn't safe for me to really be myself, to have my emotions, understood or met or anything like that. And I think unfortunately a lot of people in my generation grew up like that, and I don't like to really look at it in that kind of a way, because I feel like it kind of downplays the ways that it actually does impact and affect people, and it just kind of looks at it like, well, everybody kind of grew up like that. But I think that in order for us to learn greater emotional intelligence, it needs to be understood that that is not a healthy way of handling emotions in other people or in ourselves. And so I think that when you are an autistic girl or young woman, you learn a lot by observing other people around you. You pay attention to the dynamics between relationships between people, interactions between people. You see certain things that people do that will make other people mad or angry or sad or uncomfortable, and you really pick up on that and become attuned to that in a way where you yourself don't want to make any waves or ruffle any feathers, because it triggers in you that feeling of not being safe. And so you learn how to mask, you learn how to mirror other people, and that is how you keep yourself safe, throughout life. And so that was how I survived. That was my coping mechanism all throughout my childhood and in my early adult years. I think one of the most dangerous things is, especially for, I think, autistic girls and women who grow up in a more religious kind of environment or setting, or Christian household or anything like that, we are very much taught from, a really young age that it is so important for us to be kind and selfless and, gentle and accommodating and, caretaking of other people, and that it's selfish to think of ourselves and to, think of our needs. And this really gets, I think, ingrained in us, and we are often guilted or made to feel shame of some sort if we step outside of that, or, we end up feeling just like, we did something really wrong if we don't strictly adhere to this kind of way of being or living. And I think that that is very, very dangerous, because I know that, God created a plan for how He wanted things to be, and unfortunately, to really live in that way would put a lot of women in danger. And it is something where I think, even in therapy, it's viewed as trying to get to this point in this place where you feel safe enough to settle into being able to be in that softer, kind of gentler, kind of, way of living in life. But the reality is that that is not how most of us are able to live, or, will go on to live life, because the world is just not cut out for living life that way if you're a woman. You can try to, and you can do that, but you're going to end up in some really bad situations if you do. And I think that, eventually you learn that the hard way, and it becomes something that you recognize, that this fawning is actually truly a defense mechanism. It truly is something that you think is keeping you safe, but it's actually something that is, in a very real sense, harming us, because predatory people who are manipulative, people who do not have good intentions, people who have ulterior motives, they can sense in us that we have been programmed in this kind of a way, and they target that, and they will prey on that. And a lot of the time they think that, we are naive, or they don't think we will stand up to defend ourselves or hold them accountable. And so they notice that, they recognize that in us, that we are programmed in this kind of a way, and they don't expect us to, like I said, stand up to them in any sort of a way. And they often will, hone in on those of us who appear this way to perpetuate abuse onto us. And I don't really like talking about it in that kind of a way, because I feel like that kind of insinuates that the responsibility is on us, because we have this kind of a response to, the survival response with the fawning and all of that. And it is not our responsibility. It is not, we are not the ones that are at fault in it at all. But what I think is important is to recognize how much it is not actually keeping us safe. It's not the survival tactic that our bodies think that it is, and to become consciously aware of it to the point where we can recognize it for what it is and work to get out of that survival mode where we are fawning, so that we can step into assertiveness, step into, holding people accountable, and not people pleasing, not caring. I think that it takes a long time to deprogram some of these things, to be okay with being called selfish, to not feel guilty if you are viewed as being selfish, or if you are not caring about other people's feelings, especially people who have predatory tendencies. I think another aspect is we tend to, especially if we were raised in these more like religious kind of environments, we're very much taught that we should always look for the good in people. We should always look for the best in everybody. And I think that also can become dangerous, because you could have, I know for myself personally, when I was younger especially, you can have somebody in front of you that has absolutely the worst intentions for you, not a good person at all, and you will feel guilt in some way if you don't view this person in the best light, if you don't look for the best in them or try to see the good in them. And to, be okay with saying, I don't want to be around this person, I don't like this person, and leaving the situation. And I have not always fawned. There has been a lot of times where I was very assertive right away. I completely, stepped into not a survival mode, but, authentically, like, my own personal needs, wants, all of that, and asserted myself. But I found myself a good majority of my childhood and my young adult years fawning and being in that kind of a very much caught in between a freeze mode and a fawn mode. So I did fight. I did go into the fight and flight sometimes, but I think my main ones when I was younger was to freeze into fawn, and just was in a lot of really bad, situations, and not just relationship wise, but even with like family like situations, friends, things like that throughout my life. I think that it is just really important to recognize that these defense mechanisms that our nervous system automatically goes into to try to keep us safe is not, in fact, doing the job that it thinks that it's doing. And it is okay to make waves, to ruffle some feathers, and to have people not like you, to have people, think bad of you, to to be selfish sometimes, to not care, sometimes. I think that for a lot of people, they have to work on maybe caring more, and for some people who are in these kinds of situations and feel more sensitive towards, other people and all of that, I think that a big area that we have to work on is actually caring less. And that is hard to get to that point where you can even be okay with saying that. I think if you're somebody who genuinely cares a lot about other people and, wants to, just, I don't know, see the good in other people and all of that, it takes a lot to be able to get to a place. Something just fell off my shelf. To get to a place and a point where you can say, I do not care, I don't care, and to be okay with that. and to work to get out of these survival modes that you have been conditioned to be in for a lot of your life. And so I just found it interesting, the more that I went through a lot of therapy for these things and learned about it through just reading books and self-help things, I realized just how much I actually, and my therapist would say things to me like, your survival mechanisms and your coping strategies aren't serving you anymore, they're not. And I would wonder, what does that even mean? I didn't really understand how to even get out of it. It was something that was really confusing for a long time. Like, I understood that, maybe I was still living in certain ways that weren't serving me, but I didn't understand how to get out of them, I guess. And I think that the key to it is just to become consciously aware. And when you feel that discomfort in you, when you're so conditioned to like fawn and people please and accommodate other people, really going into that discomfort and pushing against it and doing the opposite when you are consciously aware that it comes up. And that is what brings you out of being in that kind of, I think, nervous system state. And I also think that, paying attention to a lot of your just natural inclinations to just certain behaviors. For example, when you're out with like a group of people, maybe you don't know them very well, maybe you do, I don't know, and people are talking or whatever, and you have this tendency to like smile and laugh a lot to try to appear, I think, as accommodating as you can, to not to seek the approval or the validation or fit in, but because you're trying to keep yourself safe. You're trying to not be somebody who really steps into themselves, because if you do that, your nervous system is afraid that other people are going to react, harshly to you, because that's how you were reacted to in the past. And where you want to just kind of, laugh or smile, don't. And it might make people uncomfortable. It might make people feel like you're mean or rude. If you're not genuinely being mean or rude, you don't have to worry about, what they think or what they feel about it. And just, I find that actually makes people feel uncomfortable too. And I think that just overall in, just society, it seems like people tend to put on this show to kind of, I think, be accepted by other people and like fit in and everything like that. But to me, it just feels like those connections are not genuine. And the people who genuinely are going to be good for you in your life, and people worth having around or relationships with and being close to, they're going to want you to be genuine, and you're going to want them to be genuine as well. So I just feel like, when you're able to catch yourself in those moments where you realize, I don't think this is funny, and I'm laughing and I don't know why I'm laughing, or I'm trying to smile and all of this, but I'm not really feeling like smiling today. And I don't know, I feel like there's just such an emphasis that's always put on being positive all the time, and appearing to be friendly all the time. And to me, it just doesn't make much sense, I guess, because life is filled with so many different emotions and reactions to things, and I don't understand why, people are expected to go around with a smile on their face all the time and trying to be positive all the time. It doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. And I don't think you're a pessimist either if you don't act that way. And I think that people often will try to make you think or feel that you are, if you you know, if you're not this like positive vibes like all the time kind of person. But yeah. And another thing that I wanted to add was another thing that I came across more recently was a statistic that showed that 91% of autistic women and girls will experience sexual abuse at some point in their life. And I thought that that was sickening, gut-wrenching, and really disheartening. And I think that, you know, I never want to say that the reason for this is because we fawn, or the reason for this is because we people please, or anything like that, because in no way, shape, or form is it ever our fault. The responsibility and the fault is solely on the abuser and the perpetrator, and in no way, shape, or form are we, you know, to blame. However, I do think that, like I said, like they can really sense when we are conditioned in this kind of a way. And the more that we're able to recognize in ourselves where we are fawning or freezing, and the more that we can step into that part of ourselves that is able to be assertive and able to, you know, really speak up. I'm not saying that that is going to prevent, you know, abuse from happening or abusive people from taking advantage of people, because there's many people who are assertive and they still end up getting abused. But I'm saying that I think that the reason why there are so many autistic women and girls that are targeted is because these predators seek out those who have been conditioned to fawn and to people please, and that they don't think will be as likely to defend themselves or hold them accountable or anything like that. And so that is why, you know, I think it is also really important to push back against the narrative of, you know, girls need to always be nice and always be polite and always be, you know, accommodating and selfless and all of these other things and look for the good in other people. That's one thing that I just stopped doing. And I will not let people convince me that that is a good way to live or think. And I'm not saying that you have to walk around and be a jerk, you know, and be mean to people or anything like that, but not, you know, having this mindset of thinking that that is how you need to show up in the world all the time for everybody, because it's not. So I just thought that I would share that statistic as well, because I found that to be just so disturbing and so disgusting. And I think that that needs to be talked about a lot more and addressed and taken seriously. So I just thought that I would share that. And that is it for this one.